pigeonholing a problem as multi-layered and astructural as racism is misleading at best. These issues are killing Americans, including Imani. The stats show that about 400 psychiatric beds remain closed for care. About 150 addiction beds in hospitals are similarly shut, making the issue sound like all they need is more funding for more care. That's a part of the problem, but not the one that contributed to Imani's death. The author, Ramachandran, threw a name into her story to illustrate the stats to her readers with a real person's face. Imani Fecu was the name she added, although I told her not to because her storyline misrepresented that person. The author was much more concerned with writing a story, and so this is where I can introduce my motive for this research. She crashed, and there was no safety net for her crashing, was the caption to that photo of Imani. The article misrepresented Imani Fecu's life experience and story to mainstream America, reinforcing the binary imbalance of power. Mainstream representations of black people stereotypically support an image of devaluation, criminalizes them, or hypersexualizes them. In the Imani Naja Fecu's case, the Wall Street Journal article, in short, was a call for funding support to lock up the quote-unquote crazies for their own safety as well as the protection of the public. Imani was the one who needed to be protected, but who could protect her from the pervasive harm of structural racism? Imani needed to be safe. Imani was a young black girl. She was born gifted, both academically and spiritually. She lived in the West Indian section of Flatbush, Brooklyn. Imani saw things that others could not, and she was open and honest with her providers about that. She was in psychiatric care for obvious reasons from childhood. Her mother was incarcerated when she was 7 until she was 24, and her dad was killed when she was 14. So she needed mental health care. But when Imani started to talk about the things she saw to her providers, they worked to mandate her to take medications to stop the hallucinations and report noncompliance. Some are privileged to a right to refuse treatment. Other people don't have that privilege extended to them, and their right to refuse treatment is recorded into a failure to comply. Oddly enough, it became her provider's main focus to get Imani on meds to stop the hallucinations, which to her were the least of Imani's issues. Eventually, when Imani totally abstained from heroin use when she was 19, and it was her choice to stop accepting anything unnatural into her body, a personal decision and choice that included doctor-prescribed psychiatric meds. For 5 years, Imani, while she abstained from any drug use, she struggled economically. She needed care for the trauma, and her economic insecurity was a stressor. But Imani's benefactor stopped paying for her housing because doctors insisted she was unsafe to herself because she exercised her right to refuse to take Western medication and continued having hallucinations. They stopped paying for her safety, and Imani lived homeless in the streets of New York City for refusing to take medication, a horrific stressor for a person already struggling to deal with such trauma. During the COVID-19 quarantine, Imani was sent to the Kings County Psychiatric Hospital for inviting a friend over to take brownies at her grandmother's home. During COVID-19 quarantine, previously normal behavior was not allowed, and since the home wasn't hers, her grandmother had her committed at Kings County Hospital. Doctors there prescribed meds in pill form and released her back to her grandmother's unsafe home. And Starbend recovery was the next move after she passed a COVID-19 test. She passed the test and moved in, and then the same mother that affirmed her and validated her experiences and visions at that point begged Imani to take the meds only because she believed Imani would be physically in a safe space. The benefactor agreed to resume payment for her supportive housing because Imani decided to comply. After a verbal argument and less than a month at Starbend Recovery, the administrator admitted, as uncomfortable as we all were about having Imani, There was no changing their decision, and Imani was kicked out of the safe housing she started the meds for. This elite private team of providers prescribed her an injectable medication called Invega to stop the hallucinations. Why did Dr. Sharmat prescribe injectable meds for a young woman who 5 years earlier was active in addiction using intravenous drugs and no opiate blocker? Over the course of about 3 months on these meds, her mental and physical health deteriorated drastically, and then she relapsed and overdosed on June 25, 2020. She was vocal to her providers, all of the 4 private entities, that she was suffering multiple side effects from the meds. The doctors, due to the record of her history, wrote on their records of treatment that they treated Imani for an opioid addiction, although she was, until her death, abstaining from opiate use. If the doctor prescribed an opiate blocker, she wouldn't have overdosed and died that day. The week before she passed, Imani researched and then told her providers she planned for the benefactor and the treatment team to get on board with an assisted suicide. She had a very detailed plan of action. The care team laughed it off with the benefactor that their patient wanted to die from their care. That was the week she relapsed and died alone in her grandmother's home. That part of the story was true and accurate. In contrast to treatment she was undergoing this year during the COVID-19 pandemic, here's a quote from Imani's notes from her journal dated in Healthier and Happier Times. On July 13, 2015, Imani wrote in her journal, "Feeling in control of myself is the best feeling because we are then able to think more clearly and rationally. Distress tolerance." Imani hated to be defined by labels societies placed on her. Eventually, Imani's treatment team imposed the Western medications Imani opposed. Imani, a Haitian American, firmly believed in natural and holistic healing of the Eastern and African traditions. Records from providers showed that, although Imani complained, she suffered issues related to trauma and generational trauma. Her psychiatric team were not listening to Imani because they chose to focus on treating and eliminating her hallucinations, although that was not Imani's concern, but her experience. Then the treatment team exasperated her stressors. Exercising her right to refuse treatment was met with consequences for her. Rights are not the same for all people in America. The psychiatric team exercised more control over Imani's life than Imani could. The forces of power over Imani's health and well-being, the 4 separate private entities that comprised her health team, colluded with Imani's benefactor to reinforce their power, to force Imani to submit to their power over her life. Her benefactor refused to pay for housing until Imani chose to comply. Imani voiced that she didn't understand why her perspective could not be respected. Shalini Ramashadan, the reporter who included Imani in her story of COVID-19, misrepresented this real person because structural and institutional racism thrives on the misrepresentations that reinforce stereotyping and disparity. The Wall Street Journal published an insensitive misrepresentation of Imani Naja Fecu's tragic death, but it is not surprising. The crux of the article was that it is society who needs to be protected from the crazies, quote unquote, as much as the quote unquote crazies need to be protected from themselves. Bravo, excellent example of how mutually reinforcing systems including healthcare, media, and the justice system. Imani Naja Fecu, at the age of 24, passed on to the ancestors on June 25, 2020. Her life lost more collateral damage of structural racism. And this is the story of Jennifer Fecu and Imani Naja Fecu. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless.